All right, so the previous lecture was about the Texas-Mexican War and the Mexican-American War. And so now we continue from there. What happens after the Mexican-American War? And so Mexico, kind of concluding where we left off, Mexico lost its northern half. It becomes the US Southwest. Any Mexican citizens who stay in the Southwest are legally automatically becoming US citizens within a year. These are some of the key points I'll talk about, and I'll talk about each one individually and more. Here's some big picture trends where that have to do with US expansion. And basically you have adventurers, explorers, and merchants kind of leading the way into Spanish America and Mexico. And they have amicable relationships. They're vulnerable. They go to places like Louisiana, Texas, California, and New Mexico. After that, we get the use of force or military, and that would be territorial expansion with filibusters and wars. And so that would be, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and the rest of the Southwest. And now we start entering this third period or trend, where we're looking at domestic, interethnic, interracial, and intercultural conflict. Looking at politics and economics, so not so much about the use of the military or armed groups necessarily. Politics, we're looking at laws, how people are criminalized. There's the allowing of vigilantism, how tax law affects people differently. And one of the results is economic subjugation. And then I'll show this slide again after I get past this period to talk about how the US uses economics and the military abroad. After we're done expanding from coast to coast, how do we start doing some of those things in other places that we don't make territories of the United States, but that we try to control? And obviously, in particular, talking about places in Latin America. So yeah, right now we're in the third phase. Later on, I'll focus more on the fourth. So so the Mexican-American War ends in 1848. And there were Californios who stayed there and, became US citizens by staying there more than a year after the Mexican-American War. And, they were fully intent in participating and being active in California once it became part of the United States. And they helped make that happen. They drafted a California Constitution, and 8 of the original 48 signers of the California Constitution were Californios, people who were Mexican citizens just 1 or 2 years prior. And the laws that of the state were initially printed in both English and Spanish. And this happened for the first several years until 1856. California was admitted as a US state in 1850. So for the first 6 years, laws were printed in English and Spanish. This was an exchange. They became a free state, but they had to agree to abide or comply with the Fugitive Slave Act. And so it was a free state, but if any slaves tried to escape to that free state, they had to comply by the Fugitive Slave Act and help capture and return any slaves that tried to escape there. One of the first laws passed in California in 1850 was the Civil Practice Act of 1850. It made it so that if you were Asian or Native American, or here specifically Chinese and California Indians, you would be prohibited from testifying in court. So that means that someone could show up to your house, murder your whole family, and if you were Native American or Asian, specifically Chinese, you couldn't even testify in court in your own defense. And do note how do I put it? Kind of how bland the law is called. It's not the if you're Asian or Native, you can't testify in court act. It is just the Civil Practice Act. Seems very benign. And in 1857, and so we see something happening, within a few years, within several years, by 1856, 1857, these Californios that helped to found the state end up getting excluded from full participation as US citizens in the state. And so here, for example, Manuel Dominguez in 1857 was denied the right to testify in court. Manuel Dominguez was one of those 8 original signers of the California Constitution. And even he was excluded from being able to testify in court in his own defense. And so that shows that this was applied beyond strict definitions of who's Chinese and who's Native American. Californios were mixed race. They were Native American, they were Spanish descent. They would call themselves gente de razón, people of reason. It was there, or sometimes people might say that they were Spanish. But I don't know. Those are terms. In reality, they were very mixed race. They were of Native American and even African descent, not just of Spanish or European descent. And so, yeah, even one of the original signers was denied the right to testify. The very first year that California became a state in 1850, part of the reason that California was the first state out of the Southwest after Texas to become a US state is because of how many people moved there. And the reason people moved there was because of the gold rush in 1849. There were 100,000 people that moved from the old US boundaries to this new territory, specifically to California. And so that's why they petitioned to become a state and were admitted. But the very same year that California became a state, they passed a foreign miners tax. And so that means the very year that California became a state, people already felt that there were foreigners taking their jobs, that they were, they went there, 100,000 people went there to strike it rich in gold mining, and they immediately felt like there were too many foreigners in California. And so the very first year they become a state, they were already passing laws to tax perceived foreigners. And so again, this emboldens people to take matters into their own hands and presume they know who's foreign and not, obviously without knowing. It doesn't seem like much today, $20, but back then, if you hadn't struck gold yet, $20 was a lot. And I think it was $20 a month. Then there were vagrancy acts or vagrancy laws, also referred to at that time as greaser acts. What does vagrancy mean? Today, we still see some form of vagrancy laws. Probably the most obvious would be laws having to do with loitering. And so, for example, you might see them at a liquor store or a gas station that might have signs that say no loitering. It basically means like you can't hang out here. And so places that sell alcohol in particular will have those kinds of signs just to tell people, you can't buy your liquor here and then hang out here and drink. And so they don't want people hanging out. So on that note, these vagrancy laws were implemented in places like Los Angeles, where, throughout Latin America and, in the Southwest before it became part of the United States, it was very common for downtowns to have a plaza. And the purpose of a plaza is for people to hang out and socialize. It's a public space for hanging out. And so this shows cultural clash. It shows, the ethnocentrism of the time of judging the, kind of this culture that they're encountering and judging them as, I don't know, these people must just hang out all the time because you can see them in the public plaza hanging out, and so we're going to outlaw that. And even though California was a free state, that didn't stop them from writing laws that made it so that they could get free labor from people, especially lower class people, and have it technically not be slavery. And so there was a vagrancy law, for example, in California in 1850, where if you were found drinking or drunk in the plaza or anywhere in general, but that's what they targeted, you would be arrested and be given a fine. If you couldn't pay the fine, then you could work it off. And so people would get arrested, say, I don't know, on Friday or Saturday. And then if they couldn't afford to pay the fine, on Monday, they would be put to work. They would be basically rented out to the city or to private employers who would put the people to work for the week from Monday through Friday. And at the end, and the people that they targeted with this were overwhelmingly Native American people or mixed race, but obviously of Native American descent. And so they targeted dark people and put them to work to pay off their debt, their fine. Now, technically, they would say that this was not slavery because they would pay them for it. 2/3 would be paid to the city by the employer and 1/3 to the individual. But too often they would pay the individual not with money, but with hard liquor. And I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the effects of hard liquor on Native Americans, but there's a long history of it very easily becoming addictive for Native Americans and becoming addicted to alcohol. So they would stop working on Friday. They get paid with hard liquor. They drink the hard liquor. They'd be seen in public drunk, get arrested again, and put back to work on Monday again. And so it was kind of a loophole to get free labor and not call it slavery. they called them, so in Spanish, Monday is lunes. And so they called these people Luneros because they were the ones that would be put to work on lunes, on Monday. Luneros, Mondayers. Another example of something similar would be the Indenture Act of 1860. The Indenture Act of 1860 made it so that people could just take a 15-year-old Native American person and keep them for 10 years, the prime years of their life, from age 15 to 25. And have them work for you for free. But this wasn't considered slavery because they called it an apprentice program. Or they called it an apprenticeship or indenture. You know, there was a period to it, an end period to it, so not indefinite slavery. And they called them apprentices. And so the idea is that, you know, you're going to take Native Americans who the presumption is that they don't know anything, and you're going to teach them a skill, a valuable skill that's going to help them have a job with some other employer. But for 10 years, the prime years of their youth, you don't have to pay them. You got 10 years of free labor. So these are ways in which people were impoverished, in ways in which they lost their, you know, they had just become US citizens and they were already not getting their rights as citizens. A few pictures of Pio Pico, the last governor of Alta California. Baja California stayed part of Mexico. Alta California became part of the US. And so we got rid of the Alta, we just call it California. A few pictures of him. And again, you know, you could see how he is dark. You know, he clearly has African Black ancestry. He was Black, Native American, and Mexican. But these Californios kind of thought of themselves as their own version of white. They called themselves gente de razón. People with reason. And so, you know, it's got all these problematic implications too, is, you know, that if you're not elite, it's like kind of implying you don't have basic common sense. It's the elites that have logic and reason. So California's had their issues too. It's not just the US. All right, continuing with this impoverization and criminalization is the California Land Act of 1851. This was a law that said that Californios needed to prove that their land was theirs. Okay. The burden of proof was on them to prove that their land was theirs. One of the problems with this is that this process took an average of 17 years to prove that your land was yours. In the meantime, people could squat on your land. So someone from the East Coast could go to California and just show up on your land and say, this is mine now, because you haven't been able to prove it's yours yet, because it's taking you 17 years to prove it. And even if the California landowner, after 17 years on average, is able to prove the land is theirs, at that point, they needed to pay the squatter for any improvements they made to the land. So if the squatter showed up and built a house and put up a fence and put up a barn, or, you know, tilled the soil to be able to plant something, in order to get rid of them, you have to pay them for all the things they did on your land. And the thing with Californios is that they tended to be, they were wealthy in land, but they were not wealthy in cash. In, you know, they didn't necessarily have very profitable businesses on their land. So they had status and they had land, but they did not have money. So they would end up losing their land to the people that had squatted on it because they couldn't afford to pay them for it. They also lost the land to the lawyers that they paid for 17 years. And again, they didn't have a lot of cash to pay the lawyers. So they ended up paying the lawyers with chunks of their land as well. And so all these legal ways of taking their land, of chipping away at their land. Then there were taxes. The way tax law was set up in California is that if you were a large landowner, you would have to pay high taxes. If you were a merchant or a small landowner, you wouldn't have to pay high taxes. And so again, it didn't say, you know, this is a tax law to get Californians to lose their land and make it easier for new arrivals, new Anglo-American arrivals from the East to not have to pay taxes, but that's in effect what it did. One example was, I used to work for an archive, and I was helping the archive kind of figure out more details about what was in their collections. And one of the collections was, they were records by a sheriff's department regarding the land that they would confiscate and then sell at auction for the people who couldn't pay the taxes on it. And Pio Pico himself owned tens of thousands of acres just north of Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley. He lost tens of thousands of acres because he couldn't pay the taxes. And someone bought that land for like $300 something for tens of thousands of acres, kind of, I don't know, probably a third of modern day Los Angeles County. So it's that's how, you know, one of the ways, and another way in which people lost their wealth, their land. Then there was the Preemption Act of 1853. This was an effort to both limit how much people could squat and take, and at the same time also kind of legalize what people were taking. And so the Preemption Act of 1853 said that people could squat, could just take land if it was public land, Native American land, former Spanish land grants, or Mexican land grants. So, I mean, basically, essentially all land except for land of new arrivals with the titles to their land. And it limited to 160 acres. And so that means before that, people were taking more than 160 acres and saying, this is mine. With the Preemption Act of 1853, they could take up to 160 acres, and all they had to do was kind of like record it and put boundaries. So they had to, you know, write a document, have it kind of notarized that says, from this location to that location, you know, these are the 4 points of my property, and they're marked, and I'm putting up a fence or something. And yeah, and then you could say those 160,000 acres were yours, just free land, whether it belongs to someone else or not. one of the peoples who were most affected by California becoming part of the US is the Native American population. And their population was decimated. And here's an example. In 1845, there were 150,000 Native Americans in California. Within 5 years, 1/3 was dead. By 1870, down to 30%. By 1880, 16%. So like a 90% decline in 35 years. And so why did that happen? Well, the majority had to do with disease, their exposure to diseases, their vulnerability to diseases. But a good portion was due to lack of food. And only 10% is directly attributable to violence. So in a way, it's like California was one of the last areas where Native Americans were impacted by European diseases. But then why would they have a lack of food? Well, because the people who were showing up were now enclosing their land with, you know, barbed wire and fences and so forth, keeping people out of it. You know, they were changing the ecology of the place. The influx of 100,000 people, you know, just made it so that they didn't have access to their traditional hunting grounds. They weren't given access to, say, lakes they had access to or trees they had access to before. They just, there was a big shift in their traditional ways of getting food. And there's, you know, the animals we brought in who also ate a lot of what was available. Now, only 10% is directly attributable to violence, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a significant amount of violence. And I'll get to that in just a second. And within 10 years of this, by 1890, that was the low point of the Native American population in the US. So we've never had less Native Americans in the United States than in 1890. And that's also similar to the rest of Latin America, by the way, where around 1880, 1890, they reached their lowest point. So since then, since 1890, the Native American population has been growing. We'll get more to that later. All right, deprecations. Deprecations were common in California in the second half of the 19th century. A deprecation is when people would go out and punish Native Americans for what they thought they had done. So if someone thought that one of their pigs was stolen and killed by a member of a Native American tribe, then they would get an armed group together and go punish the whole tribe for what they suspected one of the members of the tribe had done. And again, this is when 30% of them are dying from lack of access to food as well. And so those were the deprecations, going out and punishing suspected people that were suspected to be of the same group as someone who they suspected of stealing from them, for example. This word that was used a word common at the time, used to refer to Native Americans, and you can see the similarity to the N-word. Then there is this word that was used for Native American women, and it was not, it was common, especially in Northern California, where there's more documentation of this, although it probably happened in more places than that. And that is that people would take Native American women and essentially keep them as kind of like slaves, concubines, property. And one of the ways that we have this confirmed is not only from kind of people's accounts of this, but this even made it to the newspapers, not because they were alarmed that this was happening or trying to bring attention to it. It was because there were ads of people selling their women to other people. And they even had this category system where if they were asking top price for a woman, they would refer to them as fair. If they were not quite fair, they were middling. If they were not middling, they were inferior. And if they were categorized by their seller as, you know, kind of the bottom, the lowest category of women, they would call them refuse. And so one of the ways this is documented is from the ads that people would put in newspapers, selling them to each other. And there was a study done. Oh, I know I have it. There was a study done where one researcher looked into this and found that just in one county in Northern California, there were hundreds of women, Native American women in these situations. Oh yeah, the one source saw that in 1860, there were hundreds of white men who had Native American women living with them just in one county, hundreds. And this connects to the present, where in 2022, there were 650 place names that were changed across the United States, where they had words like this in their names. 28 of them were in Wisconsin, including lakes, streams, and valleys that were named with these derogatory terms towards Native Americans. Again, you know, just a couple of years ago. I'll tell you greater detail about one specific example. This is remembered as the Clear Lake or Bloody Island Massacre of 1850 in California, Northern California. Northern California is where most of the gold mining happened. There were two Anglo-American men, Andrew Kelsey and Charles Stone, who decided that they were going to get the Pomo Indians to work for them. And they put them to work on their farm and in their mine to help them, you know, strike it rich with the gold mining. They even had them build a fence around it to control when people could leave their own village. One of the most common, you know, they were regularly punished. People were whipped. There was one of the most common punishments they did is they would, they would tie people's wrists with a rope and throw it over a branch of a tree and lift it up where like their tippy toes could barely sort of touch the ground, and just punish them, torture them that way. And one of the reasons they would punish the Pomo Indians is when they would refuse or not cooperate with giving up their daughters to them for sexual assault and rape. So the Pomo Indians rebelled and killed Kelsey and Stone. But there was a vigilante group that organized itself, armed itself, and went out and slaughtered, massacred the entire Pomo village for killing Kelsey and Stone. So that's remembered as a Clear Lake or Bloody Island Massacre in 1850 in Northern California. So these were, you know, actions that individuals took, but that doesn't mean that the government didn't agree with them or support them. Here, for example, Peter Burnett was the first governor of California and this is what he said in 1851, and he was a Southerner, by the way. He said about Native Americans that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. So, you know, he's openly saying we've had a war extermination against them, and this is going to continue. And the result is they're going to be extinct. They're going to get extinct. And, you know, this is causes painful regret, but it's inevitable. Destiny. Remember manifest destiny? And, you know, we don't have the means or the wisdom to avoid this, although it's not like they were trying. And these vigilante groups who would organize themselves to punish Native Americans, it turns out that the state and the federal government would reimburse them for any expenses they incurred in the process of going out to kill Native Americans. So anyone could get together, an armed group, you know, get horses, buy guns, buy ammunition, buy supplies, go out and kill Native Americans, and then bring the bill back to the state to reimburse them for the expenses they incurred in the process. They called them private military forays. And the state would pay for it, and then the federal government would reimburse them for it. And one example of this in 1851 and 1852, they were reimbursed $1.1 million for their expenses going out to kill Native Americans. Yeah, another example would be in 1857, they reimbursed just in that year $410,000. When I was working in that archive I mentioned, you know, kind of what I was doing was creating the search guide so that they could put online, so that researchers could find out what kind of documents they had. And so one of the collections I worked on, this is a letter from one of the collections I worked on. The collection was of a man, I think he was from Maryland, who went out to California to mine and try to strike it rich. And so this was a collection of letters that he sent back to his family out east. And they saved all the letters he sent. And so, yeah, I read those letters and kind of created the search guide so people can search it. But this is one of the letters that really caught my attention. Because in 1864, you know, after like 14 years of being out there, he still hadn't, you know, he never struck it rich. And during the Civil War, he joined the Union and was fighting for the Union out in the Southwest. But it turns out that a lot of the fighting he was doing was not against Confederates, was against Native Americans. So this is a letter he wrote to his little brother in 1964 while he was a Union Civil War soldier in New Mexico. And so this is what he wrote. He said, "Dear little brother, the Navajo Indians, the crops they had planted, we destroyed. Their herds of ponies and sheep were captured. Their mountain homes devastated. Their women and children taken prisoners, and their warriors killed." And I find this interesting also because, you know, like when we're learning history, we learn about kind of the big picture. What did politicians believe, or what did generals think? But here's like someone on the ground who wasn't making the decisions, but yet having to kind of explain it to themselves or justify it for themselves, how they can participate in this. And so we get a little bit of insight into that. He says, these Indians know the terms on which peace is to be made. Bury the war hatchet forever. Emigrate to Fort Sumner, settle down permanently, and become a civilized people. And so all these ideas, right, that, you know, they're the ones that are being violent, that they're the ones that are not civilized. Yeah, he says, these are hard terms, but there is but one alternative left for them, which is a total extermination of the entire race. So they can do no better than comply with the preferred terms of peace, which are just and humane, made with a view of improving their future condition in life. So it's for their own good. It's unfortunate, but if they don't do this, we're going to exterminate them. And this letter was sent with a lock of hair. And what's the significance of that? You might have watched Westerns before, cowboy movies. And one of the common things that they like to portray in cowboy movies is that Native Americans would scalp people. To scalp someone means to cut off the skin off their scalp and take the hair. And what they don't ever portray in those Western movies is that a lot of the scalping was done to the Native Americans by US citizens and Mexican citizens. For example, in northern Mexico, the state governments in northern Mexican states, they would pay people for Native American scalps. And people from the US would kill Native Americans, take the scalp, and cross the border into Mexico to get paid for them. And they would get paid different prices for members of different tribes, and different prices for whether it was a man's or a woman's or a child's. And so this was government policy in the US and Mexico for killing Native Americans. And the cowboy movies never include any of that. They make it seem like it's only something that Native Americans ever did. And here you have a Union soldier sending hair as proof of a Native American he killed to his little brother back east. Gruesome stuff. So vigilante justice was too common in the Southwest. Lynching was one of the ways in which vigilante justice would manifest itself. People would also just get shot and killed. But lynching was particularly public, where a vigilante group would arrest someone, accuse them of a crime, have a kangaroo court, pretend court, and then publicly lynch them, and there would be an audience of the public there to watch this. And you read in Acuña how people of Mexican descent were actually lynched at a higher rate than African Americans in Mississippi at the same time. And so, yeah, this happened to an alarming degree. One example is the story of Josefa Segovia, who at the time was referred to as Juanita, in a place called Downeyville, again in Northern California. This happened in 1851, July of 1851. Yeah. So the story is basically that 1 year after California became a US state, people in Northern California were celebrating the 4th of July. So on the night of 4th of July, there's a drunk Anglo-American man who shows up to her house, pounding on the door, looking for her husband. She tells him to go away. Her husband's not home. He comes back later that night, now technically the 5th of July, and breaks the door down and goes in there looking for her husband. She grabs a knife and kills this man who broke into her home. But the next day, a vigilante group arrests her, has a pretend court trial, and some examples of how pretend it was is that there were people who tried to speak up in her defense and were not allowed. For example, there was a doctor who went up to speak in her defense, and he did get to say that she was pregnant as a way of trying to save her life. But he was kicked off the stand and kicked out of town for doing that. There was also a Nevada lawyer who tried to testify in her favor. He got beaten up for doing that. And so they were not open to actually having a real semblance of a fair trial. It was kind of just, what would I call it? It was kind of like they were just wanting to pretend to have a trial, even though their conclusions were already made up. So they had the trial and they lynched her. That made her the first person to that we know of to get lynched in California. The only woman we know that got lynched in California. And at the time, this court and the newspapers that covered this incident would all refer to her as Juanita, even though it was not her name. So apparently in 1851, California, Anglo-Americans thought that all Mexican women were called Juanitas, or that was the most common name. And so even the newspaper repeated that information and didn't use her real name, which was Josefa Segovia. So we're going to be talking more about vigilante justice and people taking the law into their own hands in the next class. But I think actually that's as far as I'll go today.